Hello and welcome to Pay Attention Interviews about Truth in Troubling Times. And today my guest is Diana Johnstone, Ph.D., who is an independent journalist and truth seeker who has published 3 books and many articles and essays, especially in alternative journals and newspapers like Counterpunch, Consortium News, and In These Times. For most of her long career, she's been living in Paris and writing about European and Western politics and peace movements. Her most recent book is a memoir of her life as a journalist and is meant to inspire those of us who continue to hope, against all obstacles and odds, to change the course of human society and culture for the better. Diana Johnstone is a lifelong political progressive who has dedicated her work and writing to the causes of world peace, social justice, and rational debate within a progressive democratic framework. She supports principles of free speech and individual rights, as well as programs for closing the wealth gap, overcoming poverty, enhancing developing economies, and ending aggressive wars among the most powerful nations on earth. I find the views of Diana Johnstone to be refreshing and informative and to align with my own as a seeker of truth and activist who strongly opposes war. Consequently, reading her new memoir, Circle in the Darkness, Memoir of a World Watcher, has been both deeply satisfying and profoundly upsetting. I've had my eyes opened about what has been happening to progressive politics in the US and Europe since at least the 1980s. And so I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak directly with Dr. Johnstone. We have many topics to move through, and I've tried to organize them into a kind of logic, starting with the main one that frames all of the others, which would be the effect of the so-called deep state. All of these topics deal with the changes that Dr. Johnstone has seen in her lifetime in the nature of progressive politics and social activism especially. So I'm going to just review the 6 topics and give a kind of overview for what we'll be talking about, and then we will launch. So the first one is the power of the deep state as it has reshaped and undermined the meaning, facts, and narratives of progressive politics through media and journalism, and also through direct interference, assassinations that connect to intelligence agencies. The second is the use of false flags and framing and the role they play today. And then the third, the influence of Michel Foucault and Jacques Attali in changing the meaning of the left. And many people may not be familiar with them, but they're very important in understanding the larger narrative. Then a little bit on the war in Yugoslavia and the Green Party in Europe. And finally, talking about the current sort of mainstream or common discourse and how it relates to world governance, surveillance, and transhumanism. So before we begin in talking about the deep state, I just wanted to ask Diana about her views of the presidential election in the US. She's a US citizen who lives abroad, and I wonder, Dr. Johnstone, how you see things going here in the US. First, let me just say welcome, and I'm so happy to have you with me. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for your interest in my book. and I appreciate that very much. I think as far as this election is concerned, I find it appalling, and I think a lot of people do. I must say my daughter was saying she was very disappointed because her only hope for this election was that there would be a very large abstention. And because frankly, we can't understand how anyone could vote for either of these candidates.
Yes, I agree. yes, I actually voted for the Green Party candidates, but that was because I felt that there was really no choice.
Well, yes, but some people couldn't because they didn't even get on the ballot. And that's one of the things that is chronically wrong with the American electoral system is this two-party system, which
Yes.
cornered people with two parties where what matters to us a lot is the foreign policy. And
Yes.
they're terrible, both of them. They're war parties. They are
Yes.
two war parties. Of all of the primary candidates, there was only one, Tulsi Gabbard, who spoke about against law, and she was
Yes.
marginalized entirely. Right?
Yes. Yes.
She was the only peace candidate. She was the only anti-war candidate at all, and she was blacked out by media and didn't have a chance. But the laws are such that it's practically impossible for a third party to get going. And so people are stuck with two parties who not only are they the only parties, but they come up with absolutely dreadful candidates.
Yes, yes, yes.
I say we couldn't vote for either one of them. And it's remarkable because there's so much antagonism in American society, precisely because I think the politics do not address real problems. Everything is distraction. For 4 years, everything's been turned around hating Trump, which is what the elite, so that everything has been, I mean, Trump is terrible, but they make him out even worse than he is. They distort what he says. It's extremely dishonest. The way he's been treated. So, I mean, I mean, he is a human being, but they treat him like an animal. And the elite despises him so. And so there's been no issue except, oh, we must get rid of this monster. And so and as for the other side, I mean, the Trump side, they campaign badly too, because what they accuse the Democrats of being socialist or on the left, which is what they're not. So that isn't honest either.
Right.
And so nobody seems to know what a real alternative would be in the United States, because no party is voicing a real alternative. And so there's this horrible choice, and I'm very worried about the future because I think the war party is now more firmly in control than ever, seeing the nominations that Biden was apparently he's winning.
Yes. So I mean, what would you think Biden? I agree. It looks like Biden is winning. I think the election is still in contention more than the media display. But what would Biden usher in your view? I mean, I see also his nominations for his cabinet as being really a direction towards war. And by the way, I was for Tulsi Gabbard, and I did support her campaign. But whatever happened with those 20 candidates in the Democratic side, there was a quick collapse of everyone. And then Biden, who really was, I think, the weakest candidate, ended up being the candidate. So it was hard to say what was happening there. Really, it didn't look in any way understandable. It wasn't understandable. But now, what would you think that a Biden administration would usher in for America?
From what I've heard and from his own past, it looks very bad indeed. From his own past, he has been in favor of every war, and in the most vile kind of ways. I mean, somebody just sent me an old article where Biden was speaking of Hasim Thaci, the gangster that we put in power in Kosovo, as the George Washington of Kosovo, which is a grotesque remark. The man is now finally under indictment and examination for all of the crimes that everyone knows he's been committing. I mean, he was a gangster that we put in power through NATO, and Biden speaks of him as George Washington, which shows a little bit his historic and intellectual level. his record in Ukraine is detestable because he was one of those who supported the coup, the overthrow of the elected president. And then by some miracle, his unqualified son ends up with a big job in an industry about which he knows nothing, with a huge salary. And he is really the worst candidate they could come up with. And it's almost as if the deep state, the power structure, is saying, it doesn't matter. We just put someone up there because we're going to do it all.
Yes,
and,
yes.
And the fact is that for the deep state, the war party, Trump was sort of in the way.
Yes.
He wasn't one of the club. He was an outsider. He didn't know politics. He didn't know how to make a government. He didn't know how to appoint decent people. He ended up with horrible people that he appointed. He didn't know the game. He didn't know Washington. But he was not in their script, and they've been just everything against him. And now with Biden, they have a figurehead. We recently said that some official bragged about how they boasted to how we lied to Trump about how many troops we have in Syria.
Yes, I saw that.
Because Trump had this sort of sensible thing of let's get our troops out of Syria. And so they lied to him about that, which shows that, you see, he was never really president.
Right.
And Biden will never really be president either, but they won't have to lie to him.
Yes.
They can tell him what they're doing or not tell him what they're doing. It won't make a bit of difference because he'll just be there as a puppet,
As a puppet, yes, I agree with you on that. And what happened in the Ukraine, I don't know why Americans cannot seem to pay attention to it, because it was a signal for what was going to happen with this Russiagate thing and this whole other thing, which I don't really want to go into right now because I want to shift. I agree with you completely about the position that Biden would be in and how quickly things could come to pass. And that's a very scary kind of, let's say, situation for the US. I think also that we want to talk about the deep state in terms of surveillance and world governance also. And I want to get into that conversation more historically from your memoir. But I wondered if there's any other thing you want to say about our current situation before we go back in time a bit.
Well, yes. I mean, this worry about what will happen. It's true that Biden is a person for wars, but usually the United States likes to choose wars that won't wipe us out. I mean, there's huge aggression against China, against Russia, but a natural reluctance to bring the world to an end, just like that. So they prefer to pick on Venezuela or Bolivia or Syria or wiping out Libya. They prefer smaller targets. But aside from that, there's this horrible atmosphere that they create, this horrible environment of distrust and hatred. And looking at the world as enemies, and it's a whole world view that is extremely unhealthy for society and for the world, to just this vision of the world as enemies, rivals, that we must beat them before they beat us. I mean, this is just such a horrible mentality. And Biden is absolutely the person on top to let them perpetuate this extremely negative moral environment.
Yes. And as you said, Trump was a wild card. I don't think that anybody in this larger deep state or war party or whatever, no one thought he would win. He didn't think he would win, I think. And so he was a wild card, but he wasn't able to really do even the good things that he thought he might do. He wasn't able to do them because I don't think he really understood what was happening completely. I think he was constantly having the rug pulled out and then just being confused by what happened. So, but with Biden coming in, there won't be any rug pulling out. It will all be smoother, and the media will be behind it also. And there's every indication that that sort of massive surveillance that 5G and the Internet of Things will be coming in, and there seems like nothing to stop it. So it looks like with Biden administration, there will be a lot of compliance with the American population, particularly more educated people who are, let's say, benefiting from the stock market, right now, that they will comply with whatever is rolling out in terms of surveillance, or perhaps, I hope not this, but war even. I mean, because as you've pointed out, and we will talk about the war in Yugoslavia, but starting with that war, there has now been a narrative that we have to do these wars for humanitarian reasons. And, those kinds of narratives came out in regard to Syria and Libya. And so, I don't know, it's very worrisome. It's very worrisome because the more intelligent people who would in the past have opposed wars, or at least understood when things don't make sense, they seem to be compliant or something.
Somehow or other, Trump, as this uncouth outsider,
Right.
wanted to unite the educated population against him. They were just horrified by his bad manners. And I know that from relatives of mine in the United States, who really just focused on, oh my goodness, what a disgrace, And somehow this scapegoat, this monster of Trump, has united all the educated people around the Democratic Party, and with no talk of issues, just Trump.
Right. Yes, exactly. It was as though the platform was defeat Trump.
Yeah.
That was it. And so, and then of course the people that support Trump are more varied. And, it turns out he got a fairly much larger percentage of the black vote than he'd gotten originally. And as support from Latinos also, and Latinx, and also from women. So, I think the thing is that the people that support Trump actually, they do understand that the other side is against them.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily know maybe always what Trump might be doing for them, but they see clearly that the Democrats are against them. And, these are often the poor people, or they're people who don't have investments in the stock markets, people who don't see a future in the kind of identity politics that the Democratic Party has been sponsoring. So, yeah, it's hard to see a bright spot in all of this, except for people like you and people like Glenn Greenwald, having departed The Intercept, and Elizabeth Voss, whom I've interviewed from Consortium News. Some very honest people are speaking out. So, that's hopeful, I think.
Yes, except that the risk of censorship seems to be getting.
Yes. Yes, it is. It's particularly on the internet, on all internet media. The risk of censorship is very high. It's very high indeed. And but there are some ways to get around it. But again, it marginalizes a lot of the information. So, with that, then I would like to turn to my first question, actually. And I'm going to use some of the quotes from your memoir, and also just trying to help listeners understand that what we just described has been coming around for a long time. It's not as though this is something that's happened in the last 10 years or so. So, you know, most baby boomers like myself like to think of Watergate as the first big occasion of whistleblowers bringing down powerful players in the Republican Party, especially Nixon, through the heroic work of a couple of independent journalists. But you write in your memoir, the Watergate scandal did immense harm to journalist ethics by glorifying Deep Throat, the anonymous source of major revelations. Deep Throat was, in fact, Deep State, an identified spook. The glory enjoyed by the Watergate journalists accredited in advance a long torrent of such quote unquote reliable intelligence reports, of which the most notorious are the weapons of mass destruction cited to justify the catastrophic invasion of Iraq in 2003. So, you know, I know when I read this in the memoir, it was one of these shocks for me to realize that Watergate was actually not the way I had conceived of it. And, you know, you talk about how the deep state took down Richard Nixon in order to get the Vietnam War off the minds of Americans like myself, and how then Watergate, the CIA, and the FBI affected journalism from then on. So I wonder if you would talk about why you see Watergate as this important watershed moment instead of perhaps the assassinations of the Kennedys or Malcolm X or, Martin Luther King. I mean, I think that I understood from what you were saying that the Watergate moment changed our view of journalism or media. It did something in the framework of the sources that were going to keep us informed, those of us who, you know, aren't experts in politics. And that turn has led to this tremendous lying and corruption in media and journalism, you know, now. So could you talk about Watergate, why it was?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to go so far as to say that this was intentional, because I'm very careful about human intentions. I think this was the effect. I saw the effect. I noticed the effects at the time. That it was sort of America regained its virtue. It was because, of course, the assassinations that you mentioned were America losing its virtue.
Right.
You'd had the Vietnam War. You'd had the assassination of the two Kennedys, Martin Luther King, and I would say also Fred Hampton.
Yes.
That was very significant to this murdering of Black
leaders.
Fred Hampton, in fact, was a quite leader looking for unity of Blacks and whites, and he was murdered. So all of this was very bad, and suddenly there was this thing that, oh, hooray, our wonderful free press and journalists have restored American virtue. And then, of course, we had an interim president who didn't make much difference at all. And then we had virtuous Jimmy Carter, who I think was virtuous, but was completely manipulated.
Yeah.
So he was more clever politically than Trump, but he was every bit as much manipulated. And it was a restoration of virtue around the issue of human rights and so on. But when you look at that whole Watergate thing, I mean, what was so terrible? Nixon, you could look at his international things. He had done terrible things. The kind of things that Watergate went after were really peccadillos compared to bombing North Vietnam. But so he was not gone after for the really big crimes, but for some sneaking some documents from the Democratic Party. Well, what's that? You know, I mean, that is the substance of it was really nothing. I mean, it's just not a big deal. Um, and but it was a restoration of the image of virtuous America, and that's why I think it was important, and especially as a model of journalism. This is what, of course, really affected me in my concern about journalism, is that it really legitimized getting your news from secret sources.
Right.
So it became, and I think in Washington especially, if you want to be a successful reporter, you have to be in with these secret services and ready to spread whatever they tell you without examining it for yourself. Just
Yeah.
sources, informed sources told me. And this is the opposite of investigative journalism.
Right.
But it was glorified by that.
So do you think that this was a turning point? I mean, obviously, let's talk about what deep state might mean, you know, because you said deep throat and deep state. Obviously, it was an intelligence agent who did inform them. But what is the deep state in your view?
Yeah, okay. Well, the term, of course, is vague because you can't absolutely put it down. You could call it the permanent state. Nothing is permanent in this world, so that doesn't quite work either.
Right.
But it's there. It's the more or less secret operations that are not open to regular scrutiny, the intelligence services, and there are a lot of them. In the United States, there are a whole lot of official intelligence services. There's the CIA, but there's a bunch of others.
Supposedly there are 17 that get named all the time, that were named, you know, by Hillary Clinton, where that there were 17 intelligence agencies that agreed that Russia had elected Trump or whatever. But, so there are a lot in the U.S., but then there are other in the world as well. There are many others.
Exactly. And so they take on a life of their own. And I mean, governments are elected and unelected, and it's changed, but there they are. They have their projects, and so they just keep going. And it's very clear when someone comes in that they don't like Trump, they just don't pay any attention, or they work against him. So it's they gain power when you have an atmosphere of international danger and war, because if the nation is supposed to be under threat, which is imaginary entirely, under threat, then you give special power to these agencies which are supposed to protect us from this terrible threat. And that means you just let them do what they want to do. And so with this Cold War and constant war atmosphere, these agencies have grown extremely powerful. And this is another aspect. This is a very important aspect of the war policy.
Yes.
Domination.
Right. And you, well, maybe this is a moment actually to turn then to the assassination of Henri Curiel, because I'm sure that most listeners don't know who he is. But in your memoir, again, it was a moment when I paid attention, and because it wasn't something, it's like when you talk about Watergate from this point of view that you talked about it, I began to see some connection then between that moment and where we are now, when journalism is just a series of lies and half-truths, mostly confusing people. And then when you talked about Henri Curiel, I also could see something about the intelligence agencies working against each other. and
Yes.
working, together or whatever. So, you mentioned his assassination. He was murdered in his home in Paris in 1978. And you came to know about that assassination through your friendship with George Pumphrey and his wife Doris, who were Americans living in France, who'd been granted political asylum there. And I wonder if you could tell us the broad outlines of the Curiel story and why it's important to understanding the effects of the deep state on European politics and actually US politics too. You say that Curiel assassination was one of the first events that brought to your attention the deadly conflicts going on in and between Western intelligence agencies. The battleground within the intelligence agencies is not simply between the agencies of separate countries, but indeed it's more complex than that, about who is in control. So if you could talk about that a bit for us.
Yes, I just this is a minor thing. George Pumphrey is a Black American who had been in the Black Panthers and found it really necessary to leave.
Yes.
From really as a matter of life and death. His wife, however, is German. And they met in anti-war while he was a soldier in Germany, and they met then, and they are lovely people anyway. And they knew Henri Curiel because he had a very interesting history himself. He came from Italian Jewish family in Egypt, and he had founded some kind of political party concerned about the poor, and anyway, he was in France, and he was sponsoring this network which was helping refugees like George Pumphrey, helping them find jobs and especially liberation fighters from oppressed third world countries. And that was, and he was working with Christians groups and humanitarian groups and so on and this was very much not appreciated by some of the governments that of those countries from which these exiles came. And in any case, the part about the intelligence agencies is this. During World War II, and the Kurils were in Egypt, and in North Africa, they had cooperated with the Gaullist services. And so when Curiel was in France, he was more or less protected by DST, which was like the FBI. I mean, the internal agency, because it was still dominated by Gaullists.
Mm-hmm.
However, the SDECE, the Service de Documentation Étrangère et Contre-Espionnage, which was the equivalent of the CIA, had been taken over after the death of de Gaulle by Alexandre de Marange, who had ties with the United States. And so after the death of de Gaulle, resignation and then death of de Gaulle, de Marange had sort of taken over this equivalent of the CIA and brought it into harmony with the United States, which was not the case with de Gaulle. You see, de Gaulle had independent, and as long as de Gaulle was in charge, he was really in charge, and he was paying attention to things, not like these fake presidents, but really, he would have the intelligence services loyal to him. But once he was gone, they became infiltrated by agents of foreign powers, to put it mildly, and especially the big foreign power. And so the Curial was protected by one service, but then he was assassinated. Now, we're not saying that the other service assassinated him, but his assassination was totally mysterious. And he was in the elevator of his home in a perfectly central part of Paris, near the Contrescarpe, if you know. The killers got away entirely, sending a message. And that we've got you and you've paid for your crimes, etc. And it was just generally accepted that this was done by a foreign intelligence service, but protected by the state. And so this showed this difference between the internal and external. There's this war between the services. And this was not just a war between the services, but it had very definite international implications. And the main suspects for killing Curiel were two. The main suspects were Mossad, because Mossad is the prime suspect for everything. Because Curiel he was a really ardent defender of seriously of a two states, of peace between Palestinians. And he had been working very hard on that. And in fact, he had arranged meetings between Israelis who were looking for peace and Palestinians. There were two suspects of possible, whether it was the Mossad from Israel.
Oh, yes, right.
That were sabotaging his efforts to make peace between Palestinians and Israelis, or whether it was BOSS, B-O-S-S, the Secret Services of South Africa, because he was also, many of the refugees that he was helping were from South Africa. And I think South Africa is probably suspect number one, but it's also interesting to note that those two at that time, those two agencies worked together so they could do each other favors.
Yes, yes. So I suppose that's similar now. I mean, one conversation I had with Elizabeth Voss was about Ghislaine Maxwell, and whether she's really under arrest or not, or if she is under arrest, if somebody wants her killed and somebody wants her protected, because it's not clear whether, if she is in prison, and no one has seen a picture of her there, but if she is, then she, like Jeffrey Epstein, could actually be killed in prison, or she could be protected. I mean, you start to get to see the complexity of these scenarios is a little bit beyond anybody's capacity to really see, what's happening. And I felt with Curiel also, the way you described him, he would seem to be just a really good person working for good outcomes. And so how could that be so threatening? He wasn't a major political player, but it must have been threatening to the agendas of the intelligence agencies.
Well, the fact is that Israel there's more than one person working for peace with the Palestinians who's been assassinated.
That's true.
I think the Israeli leaders want to keep saying that they want peace, they want a two-state solution, or they want peace, but they do everything to sabotage it, because in reality they don't. In reality, and this is pretty clear, that the long-term ambition of Israel is to possess all of Palestine. That's
Mhm.
pretty obvious.
Yes,
And,
yes.
and therefore, when somebody seems to be making progress in bringing Israelis and Palestinians together to make a settlement, that person is in grave danger. There's another instance in my book, which I think is very important, and where I was actually there, and that's
Yes.
the assassination of Issam Sartawi. And so in fact, I can't come up with a list, but I think someone could come up with a list of people who've really been getting somewhere
Mm.
in working for peace between Palestinians and Israel, and are assassinated. And then often they'll say, well, it's somebody else who did it. It was, and there are other, there was another woman from the ANC who was the ANC representative in Paris who was assassinated after that.
Hmm.
So
Mhm.
again, you had these two main suspects, the boss and the Mossad,
Mhm.
and it could be one or the other. And I must say that they are also suspects to the eternally unsolved case of the assassination of Olaf Palme, which I also
Oh, yes.
discuss
Yes, you talk about, yes, yes.
also in
I,
my book.
yes. And yes, and you make that clear also that they are the suspects for that assassination. So, sometimes in looking over this picture, it seems as though really the real governance is not by states or nations, but by these intelligence agencies, or some sort of confluence of deep states that may not be unified. I mean, I agree with you. It's hard to imagine that there's some huge unified thing that looks like a James Bond movie or something,
No,
because because
I
people,
don't get into that. I don't.
yeah, right, and because people actually, I mean, I know just from working with people, they don't work that well together. I mean, whether they're in the deep state or any state, they don't work that well together.
That's right.
Yes, so it seems to me it's much more the case that there are battles underneath of the scenarios we know about, and that those battles dominate a lot of what happens in the world, and that none of that seems to be very well, followed or investigated now by journalists, with the exceptions of people who are like you, or Assange.
Max Blumenthal,
Yes, Max Blumenthal, and
Aaron Mate, and Glenn Greenwald.
yes, that's right, and that's right, exactly. But it's just,
Name them on the finger.
yes, it's a handful of people, and then people like Assange, who is really quite tortured in prison, and Snowden, who's just becoming a Russian citizen. So yeah, to be able to understand this kind of chess game that's underneath the game is very hard, and perhaps the only way to do it, and again, by talking to Elizabeth Voss, I began to see that you look in the reports, you look for things that are missing, you look for hints, you look for what doesn't make sense,
Yes.
and so in that light, I would like to talk a little bit about false flags, because false flags and framing are still actually difficult for many Americans to understand. And honestly, when I try to speak with my friends about these things, it's still looked upon as though I'm really a conspiracy theorist, even to speak about false flags, And you say in your book that while you write quite a lot, and you write about the false flags in Israel's Six-Day War, other confusing events like the attempted murder of the Pope. And you write that these false flags happen in war. And on a smaller scale, they happen even in daily life, where they're called framing. You say that it is your impression that most Americans considered it absolutely unthinkable, at least until fairly recently, that a belligerent faction would attack its own people or friends for any reason whatsoever. But you say it can be a most effective way of influencing public opinion, not only to induce condemnation of an adversary, but also as a means to incite a third party to join the fray. And I wonder if you could give us some examples of false flags as they've influenced the progressives and the liberals in coming to understand the necessity of this idea of the necessity for war. And, I know here that I have another question about what happened in Yugoslavia. But before we get to that, I wonder if you would just talk a little bit about the logic of the false flags and the framing. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about 9/11 and what you had written in Counterpunch about it. But just to give a kind of what is the logic and how does it affect progressives and liberals?
Well, let's see. Of course, I mean, there are different kinds of false flags. I was just get mentioned different kinds of false flags because sometimes, I mean, the deliberate false flag, and the one that struck me where people wouldn't believe it were, well, of course, there were the Israeli false flags. The Israelis have been experts at that. There's this famous the Lavon affair where Israeli agents in Egypt attacked British people in order to blame the Arabs and
Oh, yes. Yeah.
in order to turn the British against. This didn't work because it was exposed. The Israelis did false flags attacking Jews in Iraq and places like that in order to frighten them to go to Israel.
Yeah. Yes.
And that was quite successful. They would attack, the Israelis attacked Jewish centers in Iraq and so on, killing not many, but it would be enough to frighten the Jewish population to move to Israel. Those are very deliberate false flags. Very interesting to my mind false flag, which isn't usually mentioned in that, is the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty, the U.S. naval vessel, which was offshore of Egypt during the Six-Day War, when Israel attacked and nearly sank that ship. Not quite, but obviously intended to. And somehow, although many people were killed, the ship stayed afloat and was rescued. But Lyndon Johnson banned the people on that ship from ever talking about this.
Wow.
Now, to my mind, the only possible reason that the Israelis were trying to sink a U.S. ship was to blame it on the Egyptians.
Yes.
I mean, to me, that's absolutely obvious. And so that was a failed. Now, then, of course, there are a lot of accidental false flags. Famous one is in 1898 when a ship, the Maine, sank in Cuba, in the Havana harbor, and it was used by the press to demand war against Spain.
Yes.
Although it was an accident. So there are these accidental ones. And I think the Gulf of Tonkin was an accidental one. There was something wrong with the radar, and they interpreted that as an attack by the Vietnamese when there wasn't such attack. But the attack, when I thought that people wouldn't believe it, was in Bosnia. And you see, although when this war in Bosnia was going on, which was encouraged by the United States, you've got to realize that the whole war in Bosnia would not have been this awful war if the US ambassador had not gone to Izetbegovic after the Serbs, Muslims, and Croats had made a peace agreement and said to Izetbegovic, leave that, abandon that peace agreement because you can do much better. And Izetbegovic renounced the peace agreement, and the war went on. And the United States deliberately wanted that war.
Yes, yes. And so maybe if we could talk about that in just a moment. Yes.
I just wanted to get to the false flag there.
Yes, just to the false flag there, yeah.
Because the Muslim forces were not that strong. In fact, they were not as strong as the Serbian forces. So their whole strategy was to bring the United States and NATO in on their side.
I see.
And so there were two separate bombings of a market, which killed people, ordinary people in the market. It was terrible. And both of these occurred just before the United Nations was about to make a decision. I mean, just in time to blame the Serbs and make the Serbs look out to be massacres. And the fact is that there were UN generals and troops there at the time who didn't believe that the Serbs had done it, who thought it had good reason to think that this had been done by the Muslims who attacked their own people in order to get the US on their side. And this is perfectly logical from their point of view. Militarily, it's absolutely logical. And in fact, one could even argue that Srebrenica was kind of a false flag, but that's very complicated. But at that time, you had the whole left enthusiastic about the Bosnian Muslims. So like, this is our Spain. They thought this was
right
cause. And so you could not, even the military officers, the British and the Canadian military officers who were there and thought this was a false flag, they couldn't get the word out because the media and everybody decided that the Serbs were the bad guys.
Yeah.
And how could you think that these darling Muslims would possibly attack their own people? Why, it's unthinkable. That's when I thought it was really unthinkable. Today, so much has gone wrong that a whole lot of people think that everything is a false flag.
Yes.
And so we've really gone from a time when nobody would believe it. Everything is taken. Well, not everything is a false flag.
Yes, this is. I feel like I've switched also from being, not understanding it at all, and really the war in Yugoslavia was one where I felt like I couldn't support it, but I didn't know exactly how to speak against it either. So, I sort of let it go.
You couldn't get any analysis into the media. I know it because I was trying and it was impossible. We'll come back to that, but just more about false flags. There are totally inventive. I mean, another false flag to mention, it's been revealed, was planned but never happened, is Operation Northwoods in 1962. Where planners, diabolical planners, were to have a plane shot down and blame it on Cuba in order to get the U.S. to go to war against Cuba.
Oh yes,
yes. And it occurred to me, in precisely now, preparing to talk to you, this Operation Northwoods was worked out in 1962 when you had a big faction in the deep state that wanted to go to war against Cuba. And it's very interesting that because the assassination of JFK, it just suddenly occurs to me, it looks exactly like Operation Northwoods.
Oh, yes.
I remember I was in the United States, I was at the university, and I remember the first news reports were very worrisome because people were saying, aha, Cuba did it. And and that could mean that, in fact, the Kennedy assassination might have been an intended false flag in order to get the U.S. to go to war on Cuba. But
Yes.
there were some common heads up at the top that didn't let that go through. But it was instantly being broadcast. Aha, Cuba, blah blah blah, and then that was withdrawn. And that's very interesting. There's something was going on.
Yes, 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 yes. I read not too long ago the long report on Mary Meyer called Mary's Mosaic that was written by Peter Janney, who was a psychologist whose father was one of the officials in the CIA. In fact, was probably connected to Mary Meyer's assassination. And in that book, he goes into detail about how her assassination was set up, because they understand the whole thing and the actors that were involved and so on, which gives you then a view into how assassinations can be carried out with even actors. I mean, literally actors who play parts, and then they are the people that are seen or understood to be doing things, whereas others have actually done them. And so, he covers Mary Meyer's assassination. She was Kennedy's lover, and she was killed a couple of years after he died, because she knew too much, and she had his journals. She had things that just wouldn't have worked if they had gotten out. And then he goes into also the John Kennedy's assassination, and of course Robert Kennedy Jr. has talked about his father's assassination and the details of it. But I think again, when I thought about those, I sort of just think about them as somebody being removed. But like you say, there might have been a bigger plan that was going to be articulated through John Kennedy's assassination that wasn't able to be brought about.
That just has occurred to me.
Yeah.
Of course, it still means, I mean, they wouldn't have used that for a false flag if they didn't want to get rid of him.
Yes.
But you see, that fits because there was this huge anger against him for not backing up the Bay of Pigs. So it actually fits. It fits with the Cuban motivation of both revenge and false flag at the same time. Only the false flag part didn't work.
Yes. So, I wanted to ask you about the 9/11 attacks, because of course I've read a lot of accounts and so on. And, at the time that 9/11 happened, I really was still a pretty innocent bystander. I mean, I didn't, I certainly saw that something was happening that was weirdly orchestrated, like what Bush was doing at the time and the planes flying in. It seemed a little weird. And then I saw the Michael Moore movie, on Fahrenheit 9/11, or what it was called, I think Fahrenheit 9/11. But at the time, I didn't really put anything together that made me think about any bigger issue, because I sort of took the logic of going to war with Afghanistan. Now I do not, but then I did. But then when the weapons of mass destruction, the whole Iraq narrative came up, I completely doubted all of that. Then I began to say, wow, this is a reason why people are agreeing to something that makes no sense. And so then looking back at the attacks on 9/11, I thought, could those have been, a false flag or a framing of something that took place, but then was used by the Bush-Cheney administration? But I wonder what your views are. I saw that,
Well, I would put that in the category of the opportunistic false flag. Not that they did it, but they sure hell took advantage of it.
Right.
He grabbed it, and you see, I do think, and there are reasons to think this. You see, okay, I'll tell you what I think. First of all, I think it's so complicated. I mean, shooting a president is if you look at it, it's very difficult, but it's kind of a simple thing to do.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
I mean, it doesn't involve really, I mean, the number of people that are involved are limited. Um, and, but but 9/11 is so huge, and it would take so many conspirators. And in a society where somebody can just rush off and say, I'm telling the story and I'm writing the book and I'll be a billionaire,
Right.
it doesn't seem to me humanly practical. I'm not saying that it's that the bad guys I, when you say you don't believe it, people say, aha, you think you believe that we're so virtuous we couldn't do that. No, I don't think that we're so virtuous we couldn't do it. I don't either think that Saudi Arabian Arabs are so virtuous that they couldn't do it if they have a motivation. And you see, my initial reaction when it happened was to think, well, finally,
Oh,
Arabs
somebody
are
gets,
starting
yeah,
back.
yeah.
To me, it was sort of obvious that they would do this. The World Trade Center is a symbol, and the Pentagon are a symbol of American power. These were symbols of
Mhm.
economic and military power. And to me, it just seemed natural that they would do this. And then people will say, oh, but the Arabs couldn't fly those planes. Well, that sounds to me racist. I don't know why. If Arabs can't fly planes, why is the United States selling them billions and billions of planes, billions
Right.
of dollars worth of planes? Obviously, Arabs are capable of flying planes. Uh, um, so the fact is that the official, but not the reports, because the reports are lies in the beginning. I mean, you start in with a lie of motive. They did this because they hate our freedom. This is ridiculous.
Mhm.
Nobody's going to do that because they hate our freedom. And that's just to say, oh, our freedom is so wonderful and lovely that people want to. No, it's because we had sent troops into Saudi Arabia, that we were invading the sacred territory, not just sacred, but the nationalist territory. The United States was moving in, and there's as much motivation for them to do that as for any other crazy thing that's done. But the way they took advantage of it, oh, they refused to go to take it as a police issue. They refused the Taliban willingness to make.
Right.
They obviously wanted to use this to make a war.
Yes, they wanted to. Yes.
They wanted to, and of course, I also think that somebody somewhere was in on this.
Mhm.
I think. I mean, there's my friend Colleen Rowley in Minneapolis in the FBI who tried to report on these people taking flying lessons, and
Oh,
got
yes, yes. Right.
you see, there were definitely signs that that somebody knew about this and was just letting it happen.
Yes, 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 yes. That's much more likely than, I mean, I think that, yes, the letting it happen. But the thing that occurred to me at the time, even the IAEA had been into Iraq. They completely said there are no weapons of mass destruction. And then that narrative that the Bush-Cheney administration used, and that then, resulted in our going to war with Iraq and all of the things that have come out of that. Really from the first Bush administration and the war in Kuwait and so on, that seemed to me to be some use of
Oh, absolutely.
it was using the 9/11 terror, and the terror was drummed into us. I mean, when I look back at the Michael Moore movie and I see how many media, I mean, he just films all of these media saying, oh, you could have terrorists in your town. You could have terrorists in Vermont. People were saying, wow, maybe they'll come and bomb Burlington, Vermont. I mean, it was a ridiculous narrative. But again, a lot of people became compliant with that narrative, and they gave up their rights in all sorts of ways, and then, didn't object in the way that they should have to going to war with Iraq, which was really without any precedent to go to war with a country that wasn't harming us in any way. And so at that point, I felt like as a country, we were falling into some sort of socially compliant view of how things had to be based on lies in the media and corrupt leadership. And that to me was the point at which I began to really look askance at media reports about the government.
Right. Well, it's a good point, because this business about the weapons of mass destruction were a total invention.
Yes.
Also an invention that Saddam Hussein was going to give weapons to Al Qaeda when they are total enemies.
Right. Right.
We don't know about that. All those people out there in the Middle East, they're all, we don't know anything about them. And so you can just play on. I mean, the official story is ridiculous. They hate our freedom.
Yeah.
You start out with and then you never explain what their motives would be. You never say, well, the U.S. is moving all over the Middle East, and they don't like that.
Right. Right.
Which is what it was about.
Right.
And so the whole thing, they present a fiction. So no wonder people think that the thing is untrue, because the official explanation is untrue.
It's untrue, but but sometimes it's so obviously a distortion. This is again where I've had a kind of loss of faith in American. It's not even just the media, but American intellectuals or, cultural pundits or political pundits. The war in Iraq was so obviously a wrong and false war, and there was so little pushback. There was some pushback, but not the right kind, because it just, there should have been a position taken strongly that this weapons of mass destruction thing is a lie. There were people being interviewed that had been in Iraq. I remember hearing a very good interview with somebody from the IAEA who said there aren't any weapons. So, it was as though something happened then that hasn't changed back, but has continued to roll forward. In American liberals and progressive also just not paying attention or caring anymore about, the American imperialism and exceptionalism and war, Well,
there are two U.S. motives that are bandied about for that. One is the oil, but I think the fact is that since we invaded Iraq, our access to the oil is less than it was before. So in fact, these supposed invasions to get oil have backfired. They don't work, because in fact, China gets more oil from Iraq than, this is totally. On the other hand, it does fit in with a long-range Israeli policy to weaken all the non-religious states in the neighborhood. It absolutely fits in with spelled out plans to weaken Syria, Iraq, also Libya, the states that were more progressive. The ones which were multi-ethnic, because it's sort of nicer for Israel to have all that area divided between Shiites and Sunnis who hate each other, and so on and so on. And it sets Israel in a stronger position. And the one thing that these wars have done is to destroy Arab nationalist states, because what remains are these sheiks, these very backward, well, Saudi Arabia and the little oil states, Qatar and this, which are totally undemocratic, which are totally, you know, under the religion. And it's precisely the more nationalist, modern, and and secular states that have been targeted. Afghanistan is different. Afghanistan, of course, is not an Arab state, so that's a strategic thing. You know, we can, from the point of view of Afghanistan, we can bother the Russians, we can bother the Chinese. That's more a strategic occupation thing. But these other wars have, in fact, helped to destroy Israel's regional enemies.
Yeah. So that does seem to be much more the motive. I agree with you, because also because of fracking and other things, actually, there's no oil crisis at all for America now. So I want to turn now to the changes in the left and in the change in the narrative. But I'm going to set aside the question I had about COVID-19 and maybe come back to it at the end when we talk about what's happening right now in the world governance kind of, let's say, framework, you know. So I'd wanted to talk with you a little bit about whether you think that's a false flag or some sort of framing of something, but I'd like to just move on then and talk about Michel Foucault and about Jacques Attali, because again, these were things in your memoir that honestly I hadn't put together. Of course, you know, I've been an academic. I understood how postmodernism and Foucault affected a lot of, let's say, I don't even know what to call it, but paradigms or frames of reference in academia. But I hadn't put it together with Attali and Macron and so on. I mean, it's a bigger narrative. So if I'd like to shift into that, if that's okay, since part of what I'm trying to do is to look at progressive and liberal politics from the point of view of how they've changed and why they no longer oppose war and why they no longer care about things like free speech and so on. So is it okay with you if we shift the gears now to that part of the interview?
Well, yeah. This is very complicated. Let's see what it can do with it. Because the big shift in the left, which is underway in especially in this period you're speaking of, when in the 1980s when Mitterrand is president of France, is the more or less abandonment of concern about the working class on the part of the left. That's part of it. Two things, because to me there are just two things about the left should be. One is against war, and one is a concern for the thing. Social justice is a term that is a little high for me. I like fairness.
Yes.
Fairness is more down to earth, is more human. You never know exactly what justice means, but I strongly believe that, you know, that there are certain basic human values. I would put it in three: the concern for truth, the sense of fairness, and reason, to put it all together. And those, I think those are basic things that are what can bring people together, can work things out. A sense of fairness, concerns of what is true, and then reasoning about them from then on. And now, when you get Foucault, you have none of those things.
Yes.
You really don't. He plays very fast and loose with facts. That's not his concern.
Do you mind if I do quote you just a moment here from the debate between Chomsky and Foucault? Because that was, you know, when you quoted in the book, I thought this is an interesting way to see it, because Noam Chomsky said basically in this debate that was, I guess, in 1971 in France,
Yeah,
that Chomsky is talking about human nature and the notion of goodness and justice and human essence and the capacity to work at something that engages our creativity. And then Foucault says basically all of these ideas, human nature, notion of goodness, justice, the essence of humans, these were created by a class system and they have to be overturned. And so then you say that he adopted the notion of class struggle, not out of the concerns about class, but out of the concerns about struggle. He wasn't speaking of justice, but of the exercise of power in a Nietzschean sort of will to power. And so that he had no goals beyond the destruction of existing society, resisting powers where you find them, and rebellion for the sake of rebellion. And I have never heard anyone say that so distinctly about Foucault, because in the academic environment, people want, to rescue something of his views.
The thing is, I felt this is something I mentioned, I think, in the memoirs. We go back to the end of the Vietnam War. I was teaching at the university before I gave it all up in one way. But I think I wrote an article at that time. I really felt that for the role of the intellectual has the opportunity to learn a lot of stuff and think things over. And the real duty of the intellectual should be to share that with people as much as possible. Therefore, I thought that teaching was very important. But of course, academia was turning to writing articles. and so I think that this is the beginning of the route of the academy. No reflection on you. I'm sure it wasn't you.
No, I left the academy also. I left after I got tenure because I could just see that I didn't want to spend my lifetime in the same debates with the same people, which is what was going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know. I wouldn't have been happy there at all. But you see, a lot of people who decided about the time of the Vietnam that they were much on the left. Mm-hmm. They weren't doing anything for anybody. But so the left became having theories about it, and then postmodernism. And so you sit there and you write some theory and you have a paper and you're on the left. Actually, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't do anything for anybody, and it's deteriorated and deteriorated. So now you have the great thing is gender studies. Well, I don't know what that does to benefit society, and certainly not the working class. But so a lot of the left academia escaped into theorizing rather than the nitty gritty of going down and talking to ordinary people and say, hey, they're fooling you. That's true. Watch out. Which is, back when I was in America, young and active, I could go to just about anybody, I didn't have educated, just anybody, and talk to them like that. And usually I'd get somewhere. But instead, you stay in your ivory tower and you have wonderful vacations and eat food, and you write these papers that don't necessarily make any sense and don't help anybody, and you're a great leftist. And so Foucault comes along, and as I say, he's been on every side of every issue, but basically he is preaching power for power's sake, individual power. And that raises a lot of questions to me. You see, then the idea became empowerment, personal empowerment. Yeah. I'm very dubious about that, because if you're empowering yourself, maybe it's at the expense of somebody else. I mean, this whole thing about power, I never felt this great desire to empowerment. I just didn't feel it. And you see, our great ideal is freedom. To me, freedom is, excuse me, but this is against the whole ideology. It's sort of an empty word, because it's freedom to do what? I mean, freedom itself is like an empty. Yeah. It's right. Freedom to do what? To go out and beat somebody up? Or, I mean, freedom, the value of the freedom to me is related to freedom to do what thing? You know, what are you going to
Right.
do?
Well, one thing that the left did stand for, though, was free speech, to be able to speak openly about topics that can be debated freely. And in
Exactly.
that way, you can
Yeah.
actually find
Yeah.
some truth.
Yes, but you see, that's related to my value of truth and reason,
Yeah.
because the way to find out truth is through debate and
Hmm.
through reason. And if you shut everybody up, you don't know what's reasonable, you don't know what's true. And
Right.
and besides, and it's free speech is not just personal freedom, it's social freedom.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
a social value. Um,
Yes.
and what I've gotten is that this left this sort of what you call the left now is only on sort of very personal. I'm free to do this or I'm free to do that, or but there's no value in what is to be done. There's not the there is no value in getting together to improve
Yes. Yes.
society.
So it's neither a communal ideal, nor is it, as you said, the free speech ideal was not an individual, but it's a social environment in which you are safe and free to speak from different perspectives and
Mm,
to have debate and dialogue, which is the only way that humans can ever find the truth,
actually,
because we're so narrow, we can't see the truth as individuals. And
right.
so that debate, dialogue, the respect for opposing sides, that has been almost eliminated from the left right now. It's almost like there's an authoritarian way of speaking, and that particularly when I'm in an environment that is distinctly progressive, there are many things that I can't say. I
Mm,
can't bring up a point of view that might differ from the sort of party line, you
right,
know.
exactly. It's gotten to that. It's incredible. It's really gotten to that, and the censorship comes with it, I mean, I can think of examples. I mean, people who are not allowed to speak for instance, a scientific subject, but because they said something that goes against the doc,
Right.
social doctrine that is, they won't let them come in. I mean, it's terrible. It's really, really, really bad.
It's really terrible. Yes.
You see, I have a feeling that a lot of people, I can't know, I'm not living in the United States, but I have a feeling that a lot of people maybe who voted for Trump didn't like Trump at all, but they didn't like this either.
That's exactly right. Yes.
That
Yes.
they didn't like this social control. You have to think this, have to think that, and they could just vote against that.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And I think that this sort of the social control of speech about gender, about many things, the climate, even the climate crisis, it is not possible to say certain things. It is not possible, to call certain things into question. And even though many very accomplished scientists, and I mentioned somewhere here that Freeman Dyson, who is someone I admired tremendously in all of his work, and I had read several of his books. And then when he came out, signing "There is no climate crisis," the letter that was signed by 500 scientists, I wanted to talk about that with friends of mine, and they wanted to look up his politics. That they couldn't talk about the subject matter that he was raising, which is that perhaps there isn't a crisis that is a global climate crisis in the way that this has been construed, because the models are wrong and because also the reasoning is wrong. And he felt that he had to get into the conversation because of the arrogance of the people who were advocating for there being one global climate crisis. But there was no room to talk about it with anybody.
No, and in fact, there's so little room that you hear people saying over scientists are all agreed. Well, I happen to know that that's not the case,
That's right.
because I happen to know some scientists and who have no strong opinion against it, but who know that there are indeed a lot of scientists. And also my friend here who is a member of the Royal Academy of Belgium, tried to organize a debate between experts in the Royal Academy, and they would not, the people who are for the official line refuse to debate with critics. They won't do it. So you can't get a debate because those who are on the official line refuse to debate with one person who doesn't agree.
Yes, and actually, you know, as you point out, the UN Commission for the Study of Climate doesn't study anything but human-caused climate change. So they don't study the changes that may have come about as a result of natural causes, which is something else that Freeman Dyson was talking about.
Well, that struck me because I was reading, you know, you read that the mandate and it's very narrow. I mean, they're not asking people to study the results of the sun, for instance, although
yes,
it has a huge result. And of course, there are economic interests involved in everything, but that's also, there's one thing too about climate change that is the number one popular argument for globalization.
Yes.
The thing, because after all, you can't affect the world climate from just here, so we must need it. But of course, you're not going to get that because, for one thing, China's going to be China. Other countries are going to do their thing, and you're not going to get globalization. You might, on the other hand, be able to discuss things with different countries. And again, the answer should be debate, free discussion, being reasonable, liking the facts.
Right.
But it's shut down. It's been shut down. And maybe they're right. I don't know, but I just don't know.
Well, you know, I mean, in preparing for this interview, I reread some interviews with Freeman Dyson, and he very clearly says it is not a global crisis. It's happening really around the Arctic, and he talks about exactly what the changes are and when they occur, and some of them may be related to human-related activity, but some of them are related to changes in the planet's atmosphere. And that unless we actually do study that, we won't understand what is happening.
Exactly.
And you know, and so so I want to come back again to this influence on the left because, again, as you point out, you know, over time the left has been the more intellectual side of, let's say, politics or activism and so on, and it also had been the place where you could speak freely, where you could have debates and where you could look at things from different angles. That has evaporated. And I don't know if Michel Foucault was one of the main reasons why it evaporated. I can sort of believe it because having been in academia, but on the other hand, I think there were a number of influences that were happening kind of simultaneously, having to do with politics, also with philosophy and so on. But I want to come around to France and regard to, you put a lot of blame on Mitterrand, Francois Mitterrand, or Mitterrand, I guess it is, for the deterioration of progressive social and political programs in France. And you say, for example, that Mitterrand's appointment of Jacques Attali, whom you describe as his Sherpa for the political summits. I thought that was a great metaphor that he is taking. He's taking him.
It's not original with me.
Oh, really? I thought it was so good. I
don't take credit for things.
Yeah, it's the Sherpa for the political summits. Yeah. That Attali was the first obvious indicator of where leftist politics would be going in Europe. You describe Attali as extremely charming, compelling, intelligent, and leading from behind the scenes. And that he began to groom his protege, Emmanuel Macron, who was appointed to his first big political job as Minister of Economy in the socialist government of Francois Hollande, designing laws to reduce worker rights. And through all of this, you say, Attali maintained his adherence to the left, which itself contributed to the changing of the meaning of the term the left. And more remarkably, and for our purposes, I want to just mention what you say that Attali avowed in 1980 for the left. He claimed sweeping good intentions, looking forward to the establishment of universal justice under global governance, whose future he predicted as being transhumanism, what you call a bright future of people enhanced by spare parts. I love that definition of transhumanism. So the perspective of global governance was entering into a conversation on the left as early as the 1980s. And I wondered if you would trace some of these ideas, beginning with Attali and then leading to Macron in our current circumstances in regard to the ideas of global governance, involving not only climate, which it does, but also surveillance, the deep state, the potential for this contact tracing for vaccinations and so on. I mean, I had no idea that all of this was going back to the 80s even. I can see that, I can see it in regard to Foucault. But I think, again, it escaped my view entirely about what was happening with Hollande and Macron. And I don't know that much about Macron, I must say. It was your book that actually kind of let me on to that picture. So,
well, yeah, okay. Let's go back to here. I don't like to say that I put blame on Mitterrand.
okay.
Because, again, that's sort of not my approach. I think he found him. I think Mitterrand wanted to be president. Thanks to Chevènement and other people, he managed to put together this left that got him to be president. And then I think he's certainly infinitely smarter than Trump, but I think also he didn't necessarily know what to do when he got there.
Oh.
And you've got to realize that, you see, Mitterrand came to power with a really rather serious socialist project. At the same time that Margaret Thatcher and Reagan were laying down the law, and the European Union was going in that direction of neoliberalism. And I think Mitterrand was faced with the experts telling him, you can't do this, the French franc will collapse. So what is really happening is that, you see, Mitterrand was not an ardent, he'd been a conservative, he was not an ardent socialist. He had adopted socialism, nice humanistic conservative socialism. And he was then faced the experts say, you can't go on with this program, it won't work. And Attali was one that he had known for years and years and years. He was younger, but he had known him and was there probably the most persuasive to say, this won't work. And so the left starts giving into, you can't do socialism. Remember Thatcher's, there is no alternative.
Uh-huh.
It was the moment of there is no alternative. So Mitterrand doesn't really, he's not an economist. He doesn't really know. And the economists say, no, that won't work. There is no alternative. And so he turns to Attali, who seems to know everything.
So that's his Sherpa, yes.
Yeah, who seems to know all of these things, and is listening to him because he doesn't know what to do. And I think, you see, that's the beginning of the socialist leaders listening to economists who are absolutely tied to great finance.
Oh, yes.
this is the takeover of, and it isn't capitalism. It isn't, in fact, the little factory owner is losing out on this. This is
Yes.
finance capital. It's much more antisocial than
Yes.
traditional capitalism, where you had the boss and the workers and they were all human.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
This is a structure, and so the experts take over because they come in. You have the politicians who make wonderful phrases. Mitterrand wrote several books. He's very literary. He knows history. He doesn't understand this, and the experts come along and say, "Well, we'll tell you how to do it."
Mm-hmm.
And they've been telling you how to do it ever since. And Attali was simply he absolutely he still has that manner. He just talks as if he just obviously knows everything about it. How could you know? And so this was, and as far as global governance is concerned, remember that already in the 70s you had the Trilateral Commission. You were already beginning to the Rockefellers Trilateral Commission.
Oh yeah, right.
They backed Jimmy Carter. They created Jimmy Carter. They discovered his talent scouts. They found this nice innocent peanut farmer who was best intentions in the world, and they made him president. And then they surrounded him with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who created all havoc already in Afghanistan by arming jihadists against the Russians. And Jimmy Carter just went along with this because he probably couldn't help it, So you see, these political leaders, once you get this technocracy taking over,
yes,
this is what you've still got, and you've got it with the climate change and everything. You now have technocrats running things, and the politicians the best ones are good at words. Some of them aren't even good at that. Right. But when you suddenly put them in front of these choices, they really don't know. They really don't know.
Yeah.
And you see, I have some theories about what people should be doing, but nobody's paying attention. But so I so much blame Mitterrand, and I'm more looking at these historic trends, and I excuse him in a way because the program was pretty ambitious, but the country wasn't in the mood for it. It had already been the new philosophers. You had already a huge reaction among intellectuals when Mitterrand came to power. You had this horrible Bernard-Henri Lévy and a whole slew of absolutely terrible intellectuals.
So what do you hold so much against Bernard-Henri Lévy? Because some people I know like him. So I was wondering.
Well, they're not in France, because I don't know anybody in France who likes him.
And so, okay, so he was one of the people who initially influenced Mitterrand in the other.
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that he'd helped change the mood in the media and so on. But I don't think it wasn't so much his influence. I'm just saying that you had a whole voices. I mean, Bernard-Henri Lévy is an influence peddler. He is on the board of this, that, and the other. He's very rich. He invites people. He makes careers of people. He's a career maker, and he has enormous influence in the media. He wants to write something. I do not know one single person in France who can stand the sight of him.
I see.
Apparently, he's much more popular in New York.
Yes. That's where I've heard about him more. I mean,
Yeah.
I have, I have only heard about him in New York, actually.
He's unbearable. I mean, he's totally dishonest. He's been after every possible war. He rushed to Ukraine to urge on the coup.
I see. I see.
He's for every possible war. Notably, he practically talked the French government into the war in Libya, and he said he did it as a Jew for Israel. So he's he's really, someone wrote a book mentioning he amounts to an agent of influence for Israel. And his philosophy has been that France is essentially fascist. And this is a sort of paranoid Jewish fantasy that ordinary people hate Jews. And you're very suspicious of ordinary people, because if they get their way, they'll persecute the Jews.
Now, this is the philosophy in France. You're saying
the philosophy of Bernard Lévy.
I see.
He says that the basic philosophy of France is fascism, and everybody should be feeling guilty about this, and compensating for it in one way or another. No, I mean, he's horrible, and the thing is, he cares nothing about the truth. But I was just mentioning to say that that by the time Mitterrand came to power, BHL was an influence in the media. And the French people, there had been this big 68, which had the tide had turned, and it was back that really going ahead with a socialist program would take a lot of popular enthusiasm and a readiness to make certain sacrifices for the greater good. And I think that the French population was not in that psychological state. They voted for the common program for various reasons, because people vote for something rather than something else. But there wasn't the kind of enthusiasm that would carry through a program that would be opposed by other European neighbors, the United States for sure. There has to be a certain popular courage to go ahead with a program like that. And it wasn't there. So I don't blame Mitterrand, because I think he could look around, he could realize that the French people weren't. There's this famous statement that at the end of World War II, André Malraux, the writer I wrote a thesis on, became close to de Gaulle. And he quotes, de Gaulle told him, "Le peuple français ne veut pas de révolution." The French people do not want a revolution. And so that was a big thing to Mitterrand, because he digested that, because he had written in favor of the Spanish Civil War and various other things. But it is a recognition that, well, if the people don't want a revolution, you really can't make one, And
so the times really weren't right, and the conditions weren't right. But then what came out of this sort of things lead to Macron and where we are right now.
Right. And then it gets going that way, and and then what happens then is that the socialists, the choice became between the common program, or the socialist program, and the European Union, which wasn't the European Union then, it was the European Community. But anyway, it's the same thing. Between the choice between socialism and Europe. And so under the influence of Attali and everybody else, all the intellectuals, the choice went by the left for Europe. And it started becoming an ideal. And then they started justifying it by saying, well, Europe is so wonderful, or it would be wonderful, or it will be wonderful if we make social Europe, which they have no way of making. And so bit by bit, they dropped the socialist ideal in favor of Europe. And that leads to an if you're for Europe, it's because nationalism is bad.
Yeah.
You mustn't care too much about your own country. And that leads to globalism.
Yes, yes. And that's really where we've been, is
And
that,
that
and
leads right to globalism. It's bad to care about your own country. That's selfish and nationalist. You must open borders and everybody like that, which is exactly the financial capital globalist project.
yes, it is.
And the left goes along with it because it's so nice. Everybody can go everywhere. But that, frankly, I mean, when you get to the practicalities of it, that's a mess. That's just an unbelievable mess. But uh, this, they also, people don't realize that the little space that we have for something called democracy has to have a spatial dimension.
Yes,
Uh,
exactly. It has to have borders. It has to have some principles and structure to make that operate. So what has to operate in democracy is free debate. It
yeah,
is that using, as one of the scientists that I interviewed near the beginning of my interview program, he says that our reason actually is a social persuasion. We have to debate in order to find reason. We are not reasonable as individuals. We're driven by lots of unreasonable things. And so then we have to debate to find reason, to find truth, to find scientific truth. We have to debate. Science is always based on a negative hypothesis, to disprove it. So, it's like that is what is eliminated by globalization and global governance, and that the whole movement to be without borders, it actually eliminates these different points of view because there's a single point of view. I mean, you see it coming in under the climate crisis. You see it coming in under these economic movements that have increased this wealth gap. Like it's an impossible wealth gap in the US now. As the economy is shutting down, the stock market is at the highest levels. I mean, it doesn't make sense. It's because the stock market is not relating to the actual economy, and it's relating to something else. So, my feeling is as we move more and more towards this so-called global governance, we move more and more towards authoritarianism and oppression, and no debate, no conversation, no capitalism even. I mean, this isn't capitalism, it's something else, when the stock market and the economy are out of sync completely.
it's certainly not traditional capitalism. It's end up with a dictatorship of finance capital, and
Yes,
always finance capital, because they play around with money, and they don't, there's absolutely nothing like free competition here,
that's
because
right.
something can, a business or can be producing something that people absolutely adore and want, and etc. But if it doesn't have a profit margin bigger than some other, oops, off it goes, it's erased.
Yes,
uh,
yes,
this so all of the supposed virtues of capitalism are eliminated in this system, uh,
yes, yes.
and they still call it a free market, and it's not a free market at all.
It's not, there's nothing free about it. And, I mean, I see even now in the situation that we're in here in the US with a COVID-19 and the shutdowns and so on. I live I live near the state capital of Vermont, and I live in a small community. I live in a small town, but then I go to the town of Montpellier, and it has, about 8,000 people. But now many of the shops are out of business. They've had to go out of business, and everyone has to shop on Amazon. There's no other way. There's nothing available. You can't go to the little shop or the hardware store. All of that's gone. It's been wiped out since this whole COVID shutdown. And it's like we all have to be doing our business on Zoom. You know, I do my therapy business on Zoom. I shop on Amazon. I'm relating to people through Google or the internet, YouTube, and there is no freedom for the businesses that I was supporting and loved, because they're gone. You know?
Exactly. And you see this system is terrible. And you see, but I think you see, I think if you had a social system, I mean, you say social, the trouble is in the United States, nobody knows what you mean when you say socialist. But you see, I would say something like Amazon should be, that's a public service. It should be like with the post office. It should be a public service, and the profits should, in this emergency, should go to support the little stores that are being hurt by it. You see, you could do that. You could do that. You could do that.
Yeah.
But nobody even suggests doing that in
That's
the
right.
class.
That's right.
People aren't, they're thinking about other things. They're not thinking about what I'm just talking about. You see, I think politics should be not big theories, but practical solutions. Thinking about what is the problem and what is a fair solution to a problem. And that could be it. Have Amazon as a public service, and then you wouldn't have Mr. Bezos getting richer and richer and richer. In fact, I think there should be a ceiling on incomes and a floor on wages. I think this huge discrepancy of wealth is wrong. It's not fair. And it puts too much power in the hands of people who just do what they want with it. And if you had a serious political movement in the United States, they would be demanding a ceiling on salaries and a floor on wages, and they were demanding that certain things like the social media and so on should be public services.
Yes.
And any profit that comes from that, and there should be less profit coming from it, because a lot of the profit comes from advertising that they get people to, that goes to the surveillance part. Knowing what we want and blah, blah, blah. And you see, I could sit down in a week, I could write a political program. I really could. And we could discuss it with it, but there's nobody to discuss it with. There's people, instead they're quarreling over trivial, silly things about gender and things like that, which are of no real importance whatsoever. And there should be study groups for things like artificial intelligence, which frightens me very much.
Yes. And so let's kind of turn our conversation finally towards where I first came to meet you and your work was through the essay you did for Consortium News called The 2020 Election: Global Governance Meets Bourgeois Democracy. And when I read that, I thought, who is this person? I must find out immediately who this person is, because she's got a way of thinking about things that makes sense to me. And I actually had never heard of the Transition Integrity Project because I don't read the mainstream media. I honestly didn't even know about it at that point. Then I started to look it up, and I had not heard of Berggruen either, or any of his work. But I had participated in a symposium in New York City that was hosted by the New York Psychoanalytic, and it was on the topic of immortality. And there were people there who were, there was a physicist, there were a couple of economists, there was a postmodern philosopher, and then me. And I was there, invited at the last minute. I'm hardly even noticed in the program. Somebody said, I was at a dinner party, somebody said, oh, we're desperate to find someone who actually doesn't believe that immortality is a better thing. And I was like, oh, I'd be happy to come. And I think mortality is wonderful. I'm glad that we're here for a brief period of time. I would never want to be here for a long time. And I see also the Greeks, in the way they understood the mortals versus the immortals, they were creating a philosophy that we should abide by. And I've been a longtime Buddhist and so on. Anyway, I went to this thing at the last minute. I was a speaker and I heard things that I have never heard. I heard about this cryogenics and people freezing their heads even in order to get a body later when we have the perfect bodies. I heard about the little robots that go into the bloodstream that will clean up everything that's wrong in our bodies. I heard about the overall, let's say, trajectory of Google, which is to develop the means for immortality. And they meant at least 150 years for humans. But which humans? Like, who are they talking about?
Yes.
You know, yes. Who are they talking about? And but I had never heard of such a thing. And then I began to look into that a little bit and to see that the telecommunications companies, the people, let's say, the people that back Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple were almost all in agreement about transhumanism. And then I came to find out about singularity and blah, blah, blah. There's an awful lot that is out there that is connected to technology, that is also connected to the ideal of global governance, to the climate change narrative. And a lot of it, honestly, it emanates from Silicon Valley in the United States. And it seems like it also is connected somewhat to Macron. I mean, I get the feeling that what's going on in France, partly from your essay, also intersects with what's in Silicon Valley. And so I wondered if you could say what you think about this, and if you think that this lockdown that we're in, which is actually, again, it's impossible. I say to people all the time, please check the Johns Hopkins site on the mortality analysis of COVID virus, because the death rates are coming down. They're coming down across the board. And in some countries, they're now at the level of an ordinary flu. And partly this is because as we collect more data, then of course the statistics for the numbers of death will go down, because those people who are diagnosed, you know, what's the ratio for the dying? And you know, and about 80% of the people who have died from COVID-19 in the US are over 65. So they probably would have died from something, you know, also if they hadn't died from that. So I guess I wonder about the narrative around COVID and the way it's being used to keep people compliant. Here in Vermont, we've had one death since early summer, one more death from COVID. It was an older person. And we have some cases because they're the kids in school. They're spreading some of the virus, and it's not increasing hospitalizations. You know, there are no, like I happen to know there are 21 people in hospitals in Vermont right now with COVID, 2 people in the ICU. So it's like the narrative about COVID has changed as it's moved along, kind of like the narrative about 9/11 changed. At first, you know, we were going to do this, then we were going to do that, then we're giving up our rights to privacy, then we're going to war with Iraq. And at first we were flattening the curve, we were emptying the hospitals, we were going to get the death rate down. Now we're doing something else. We're dealing with new cases, you know, that there are cases. So I simply wonder about the social compliance that's going on, where people are wearing masks as though that's the moral thing. You know, it's like wearing a mask means you're a good person. Like that's all it takes, you know, to be a good person now is to wear a mask. So I'm sorry to unload so much, but all of this came into my reading that essay by you.
Yeah, I have a slightly
Yes.
different take on it. I mean, I just finished reading this book, COVID-19, The Great Reset. And
yes, I saw it. I haven't read it.
And they seem to be gleeful over the COVID, because it's going to change everything. It's going to completely transform the world. I think of COVID being a little bit of another opportunist thing. I don't think they created it.
No.
I think they seized on it as
Yeah.
as something to use. And also, I mean, when they say that everybody is going to be people because of fear of COVID, I don't think people are that frightened. I mean, people put on masks because it's polite or something, and there's the rule. But I don't find, and I think people are less and less afraid of it. I was much more afraid of what I read in that book than
Yes.
and it's not a conspiracy. These are just the technocrats of this technocracy writing the future the way the way technocracy is planning it, and they were planning it before COVID-19. This has been in the works, and their big excuse was climate change. That was their big excuse. Now they use COVID as an excuse too. But I don't think I don't think they would go to all this trouble to manipulate people, because people are already totally manipulated. I mean, you don't have to do anything fancy to get in control of populations. The populations are totally uncontrolled as it is. I mean, there is no real resistance.
That's true.
And they are just planning the new phase, a new industrial revolution. And the new industrial revolution is all around digital stuff. And you see, here's another thing, if I were in politics, people don't like this. You see, what they've been doing is they are replacing human beings with, well, it's becoming impossible to find when you have a problem with your insurance or anything, you can't speak to a human being, because
right.
a machine who doesn't understand the problem, right?
Yes.
Gives you a choice of things, and it's none of those, and there's nothing you can do, and they want to give us more and more of that. At the same time, they complain about unemployment, where they're killing jobs like mad. There are all sorts of human people. I would love to get a human person and have that human person have a well-paying job who could answer my question when I want to know how come my insurance won't pay for the leak in my roof. But
right.
They are planning a totally dehumanized world with benefits for some happy few that can put themselves freezing for a while and then take their brain out and something. I mean, I think it's insane. It's totally anti-human.
Yes.
But I don't think it helps to talk about conspiracies, because that personalizes it. And it's a matter of, I mean, it isn't the fault of Bezos. Sounds really awful. So it is some of the others. It isn't the fault of Bill Gates. It's the fault of a system which allows a certain number of individuals, because they're very good at screwing around and getting money, having such power. Just focusing on bad individuals, to me, is a distraction from trying to organize to change the structure, which is deadly, which I think is absolutely inhuman, along with war. Because they talk about doing everything for the environment except demilitarizing, which would be a step in the right direction.
Right.
I think we are governed right now by insane criminals, and but it's not a matter of them individually. It's the structure of society has done this, and I won't live long enough to get out of this.
But what would be your vision of how, I agree with you that ordinary people are very frustrated by the conditions in which they're living, but I don't see, at least among progressives, liberals, the people that I hang out with, I don't see big conversations about this. Exactly. I don't see the big questions being asked. I don't even know how to start those conversations except in doing these kinds of interviews. Because I can talk to you, but you don't live close by. So, it's hard to know what is next if you really do see how corrupt, how bad, how nonsensical and inhumane our governments have become. Where do you go with that? It's hard to see.
Well, yeah, it certainly is. I can say the problem is I'm too old and weak to do anything about it. I mean, I can't go out and talk to people. I can hardly walk across my apartment.
But you're talking to me right now. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that is something. But is there something more that you could think about
Well,
if you?
yes, I have thought about it. I said I could think of a program, but the problem is, to have a program, you have to have this contact with other people. You have to have other people want to see something. Now, I felt in the last couple of years, there's been this program movement in France, the Yellow Vests.
Yes.
Which is just ordinary people who are fed up with things, who are protesting, and the repression has been horrible.
Wow.
I mean, they have been physically beaten, and of course, sometimes you have these black blocs and antifas who go in and sort of provoke them. But these perfectly decent, hardworking citizens who are just protesting about, a lot of them are nurses, and boy, this epidemic has proven that they're right, because France a few years ago could boast of the best health service in the world, and they have been systematically cutting out beds out of hospitals, firing people, so that the hospitals are worse and worse. The emergency rooms are overcrowded, so that and I read that the Chinese, when they had the outbreak, in a few days they built another hospital to have more hospital beds. Well, why can't they do that here? They haven't done that, and so there's a second wave, and they're just as overcrowded as they were. They have nothing. They're not taking the lesson that, look, which already Yellow Vests were, because a lot of them were nurses who were complaining about the terrible situation working in hospitals.
Well, who is it then making the decisions to oppress the Yellow Vest? I mean, who is that? Is that the Macron government, or
yes,
who goes?
Because there's the interior minister who's in charge of national police. So you have national police, and it's there's more than one national police. There's national police and there's CRS, and they can send in people. I mean, they've been shooting bullets, rubber bullets, and several people lost an eye because they shot them aiming right straight into the crowd and knocking out. This is direct repression, and then of course there's going to be more and more verbal repression.
Right.
So it is very hard, but I feel that the Yellow Vest movement is not completely dead. It's mostly people in the countryside.
Yes.
Because a lot of the city people are, into globalization or something like that. They don't care. This is people who are really living ordinary lives in places that aren't favored. And I think this, but it's very hard because the power has all sorts of means of repression. And I don't think it's, I think they want to manipulate people much more than they want to know about them. I mean, I think the spying on us, I don't mind being spied on, but I do mind being manipulated or hit over the head with the
Yes. Yes. So do you think that France, I mean, I think I read something the other day that you said that you think it's unlikely in any kind of alliance of so you sort of see the U.S. allying against Russia in various ways, and you see the U.S. allying with Germany, and then France allying maybe more with Russia. Is that correct?
Well, I think there are a whole lot of people, even at the top in France. I mean, not the very top, but I think you could say that the French, I don't know, ruling class, I don't know, would really like to have better relations with Russia, but
Uh,
they won't dare
oh,
because they're dependent on Germany. You see, and everybody's dependent on the United States. You know why they're dependent on the United States? Because they have to sell things to the United States.
yeah.
The United States sits there with all its dollars and gobbles up everybody's goods without paying for them because they
Mm-hmm.
don't have to, because the dollar,
Mm-hmm. Dominates, right?
And nobody can go again. They let themselves be bullied by the United States because they need the market.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
Uh,
that has been the case, though, but perhaps it's changing a little. I saw that China and some of the East Asian countries are allying in a marketplace way together for a new kind of dominance.
yeah.
I mean, I don't understand all of it, but it does seem that there will be somewhat of a blowback from China on the hegemony of the US and the imperialism of the US.
I think there. I just hope so, because really we're heading to worse and worse.
Do you have a sense that, I mean, something that you said and then some other things I read did give me, I mean, many things I've been reading have given me a real fear about nuclear war, about the potentials for the way that the media was promoting the idea that the Russians had elected Trump because they had, screwed up with the elections and that they then were manipulating Trump, et cetera, has set up a kind of anxiety. I don't think it's a negativity, but I think an anxiety about Russia that has been ongoing and continues. And it was very clear, as you said, that Putin came out like de Gaulle, saying he wants a multipolar world and not a unipolar world. And ever since he's come out that way, there's been more and more of this buildup about anxiety about Russia and what is Russia doing. And I, I, I know also that we're in various wars against Russia. Well, the Ukraine situation was one. I just worry that there's some sort of movement towards some kind of war, and that these extreme situations that we're in terms of the kinds of repression and the lack of free speech and so on, that we're moving somehow towards some massive war. I don't know if you have that.
Well, I think so. Without knowing what the war is, I think that this type of censorship, this
Yeah,
type is the type of censorship you use when you have a war. You know,
yeah,
um, it's exactly this mind control that you have. This is the enemy. That's the bad guy, and everybody has to believe that, and nobody can disagree with that. I mean, this is the kind of propaganda that leads to war, and it's to enable the rulers to go on building up the military industrial complex, modernizing nuclear weapons, preparing
right,
for space war. I mean, my God, what else? And
right,
this is just but of course, accusing them of being interfering in the election, they can call it Russian aggression. They aggressed us. They're the aggressor. They messed in our election, which is grotesque because, I mean,
right, right.
I mean, it's what they really want is, they don't want a war. They want Russia to collapse. They want, they might want little wars using Ukraine,
Mm,
but what they really want is they want regime change. They want to control Russia the way they felt they were controlling with Yeltsin. You know.
ah.
because
see.
all these resources in Russia, you know, it's like, so why did you climb the mountain? Because it's there. Why do we have to conquer Russia? Because it's there. You can't just let it be there. You can't,
Mm-hmm.
the United States can't let anybody just be there. We
Yeah.
have to dominate. We have to lead. And these people are pathological. I mean, and they
Well,
take every possible risk because they feel compelled that we must be in charge of everything. And I mean, this is similar.
yes, yes, it does seem a lot to me. And so this might be a good place to end, even though it's a
I
sort
think
of
we have to.
bleak place to end. But, you know, just having this conversation with you gives me some hope, because we were able to speak freely, and
Yeah.
and hopefully it won't be terribly censored. At least if it's taken down, I know now if it's taken down from YouTube, it's put up some other place. So, you know, I I I hope that you go on as long as you can. You seem very fit and very competent, even though you might not move around a lot, but you're doing well. I hope you go on writing and contributing. And I so really appreciate being able to speak with you, because it's been actually kind of just feels good, you know.
Well, it feels good for me to talk with you. It's lovely. I'm very happy. I mean, I enjoy the experience of talking with you. It's very nice.